Scott, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. More and more Americans, by the way, are choosing to stay in Russia. I see my good friend Tara Reid, the whistleblower from Joe Biden's private office, has now decided to go and live there. Mr. Snowden, of course, the whistleblower of note, who has told us so much about how the security state spies on us and sets us up in various ways, and some others that I've seen recently, actors and the like. Your reception in Russia seemed to be a good one. Did you ever think of staying?
Absolutely not. I mean, the reception, of course, was very good. But I'm an American. I'm an American patriot. This is my country. I love my country, and I defend my country. And there's various ways of defending your country. And one of the best ways of defending your country is to try and fix it when it's broken. And America's broken right now. But as an American patriot, my duty and responsibility is to stay here at home and try to fix that which is wrong, to try to cure that which ails us, not to run away. I'm not denigrating the choices made by others. Free will is a thing, but my duty, my responsibility, my loyalties are to the United States of America. That doesn't mean that I can't travel to places like Russia, seek to reach out to the Russian people, to get a better understanding of the Russian nation, of the Russian soul, to capture that experience and to bring it back to the United States in an effort, an uphill effort, but an effort nonetheless to try and change the mindset in this country about Russia so that we don't waste our resources, squander our efforts in futile and dangerous conflict with Russia where none needs to exist. We'd be better off turning our efforts inward to fix the many problems that exist in this country and to find a way to live in peace and harmony with the Russian nation, which is a great nation populated by a great people.
Amen. Where did you go and what did you do there?
Well, the primary mission of this visit was a book tour. I've written a book, Disarming the Time of Perestroika, that not only I think captures a very important time in history, that is the implementation of the first ever nuclear disarmament treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And I remind people that not only did we get rid of nuclear weapons, but it was done in an environment that in some ways parallels the tension that exists today, in other ways exceeds it. It was you know this, George, in the 1980s, how dangerous it was between the United States and the Soviet Union. And yet, through the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, through arms control, we found a way to come together and work cooperatively, as friends even, to get rid of these weapons. So the book isn't just a piece of history. I call it a template of hope. When people say, how can we get out of this mess that we're currently in? I say, we have an example, my book. And book was published in Russian by Komsomolskaya Pravda. And I had the opportunity to go to Russia on a tour, an extensive tour, 12 cities over the course of 26 days, and bring this book to the Russian people. And in doing so, engage in some very meaningful conversations. It's not an easy topic. The Russians feel betrayed by the West. There is not the trust that used to exist. There's a lot of bad feeling between the Russian people and the governments of the West, but there's also a lot of kindness in their hearts and a willingness to work with the people of the United States, the people of the West. So I went to Novosibirsk, third largest city, fastest growing economy in Russia. If anybody thinks sanctions is having an impact on Russia, I'm just here to tell you that it's not. I witnessed a vibrant, vigorous, thriving nation. The economic engine's in full swing. There's construction everywhere. It's a nation that's alive, that's thriving. I went to Irkutsk, the history and the beauty of that part of Siberia. St. Petersburg. I've never been there before, and every stone in that city is soaked in the blood of people who died in the revolution, people who died during the Second World War. It's a city that screams history. You have to see the city to understand Russia. I went to Moscow. I was in Moscow during the Victory Day parade. It's not a propaganda exercise. It's a genuine expression of the patriotism of the Russian people, and that was made clear to me by what I saw. I traveled to Ekaterinburg, a place where, of course, Tsar Nicholas and his family were killed. It's one of the largest growing economies in Russia today. It's home of tremendous industry and history. I got to go back to Vodkinsk, where it all began, the city where the arms control treaty was implemented, where I spent 2 years of my life going there. Kazan, you want to talk about some interesting? I went to Kazan and Grozny, two Muslim nations, and the relationship between the Orthodox Russians, deeply religious people, and the Muslims of Tatarstan and Chechnya are amazing. They live side by side in peace and harmony. It's a lesson to anybody who doesn't think that Christianity and Islam can peacefully coexist. Volgograd, the history of that battle, formerly Stalingrad, to see the Motherland Calls statue at Mamayev Kurgan and just feel the shudder down your spine as you understand the scope and scale of the sacrifice that was made by the Soviet people in defending their nation against the scourge of Nazi ideology. I went to Grozny, as I said, to meet the Chechen people. I went to Sevastopol on Crimea to see that. And I finished up in Sochi. Sochi, a city that has been built, redefined through billions of dollars of investment. It's still growing. It's a top-notch city. And all along, I met the working class of Russia, the real people of Russia, people that make Russia work. And we had frank and honest and open discussions. And it was just a wonderful tour. I hope that I can do the Russian people justice in the work that I'm going to try and do now that I'm home, to try and transfer what I saw, what I learned to the American public, to the Western public at large, in an effort to overcome the disease of Russophobia that seems to have gripped our collective societies.
Well, you're doing it here very well. Jenny in the YouTube chat asks, did Scott get any hassle on his return at the airport? Did you?
Yeah, of course I did. But I will say this, it was expected. You can't be somebody with my profile, my background, and travel to Russia and not be expected to be subjected to some severe questioning upon return. But I will say this about the Customs and Border Patrol officers that I dealt with. They were extremely professional. They were courteous. They were cordial, and they were professional. And there was no, this wasn't, something done with bad intent. They were doing their jobs. They did their jobs very well. And we parted on very good terms. There's no resentment on my part for anything they did. I mean, it was inconvenient to be held up for several hours, but that's life.
Let's turn to the war. The tactics seem to be, the spring counteroffensive never happened. Maybe it'll be a summer counteroffensive, maybe a winter one, maybe it'll never happen. But the spring one didn't happen. But new tactics were deployed. The Russians called them terrorist tactics, and some of them undoubtedly are. They would meet any objective criteria for terrorist acts. And the Russians seem, I know this for a fact, and you probably do too, the Russians feel that the British are egging on the Kyiv regime into more and more acts of individual terror, which of course is ironic, as countries like Britain are never done accusing other people of being terrorists.
There's no doubt that the British are playing a leading role in advising the Ukrainian government, and in particular the Ukrainian intelligence services, on the conduct of this conflict. And the British are specialists in playing the role of the underdog. That is, to be the side that has less power, but to seek to use unconventional means to maximize potential. They were behind the attack on the Kerch Bridge, and they're behind the current onslaught of drones against Russian cities. But again, they destroyed civilian infrastructure and they killed civilians. There was no military, impact of these actions on Russia. What the British, I think, have failed to understand is that they are giving Russia the green light to strike what Russia calls the decision-making centers. I just ask people when they keep telling me Russia invaded, there's a war. Guys, there wasn't a war. There isn't a war. If there was a war, there would be no such thing as a decision-making center still in existence today, because they would have been destroyed on day one. Russia has had a soft hand in this. The fact that Russia has had to increase the scope and scale of its activities is because NATO has made the decision to pour tens of billions of dollars of military equipment backed by intelligence, operational training, planning, and British hands-on efforts to inflict harm on the Russian people. So there is an escalation that's taking place. But just imagine if Boris Johnson hadn't flown to Kyiv in March of 2022, and that the Ukrainians had sat down in Istanbul with the Russians on April 1st, as they were planned to do, to sign a peace treaty that would have brought an end to this war and allowed Ukraine to retain the territorial integrity of at least Zaporizhia and Kherson, and Donbass would have been on the table because it wouldn't have been absorbed into Russia. Imagine the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops would be alive today, the tens of thousands of Russian troops, the tens of millions of Ukrainian civilians that wouldn't have been displaced, the millions of lives of the children. No one talks about the children whose lives have been disrupted. They're not getting the education they need. They're not getting the stability that everybody says is a example of a mandatory part of child raising. No one talks about this. All of this would have been avoided had the British not intervened. The British government is soaked in the blood of the Ukrainian people. The British government is solely to blame for the suffering that's taking place right now. And I think the Russians are getting fed up with it. They're tired of the rhetoric of Ben Wallace. I mean, if you want to talk about a man who is self-indicting himself as one of the most egregious war criminals in modern history, it's Ben Wallace. And, one can only hope that at some point in time in the future, that justice will be brought to bear on people like Wallace and others who have been encouraging this conflict.
I had hoped to tell little Ben that at the Oxford Union in a debate where he was slated to face me, but he didn't have the courage to turn up. But what happens next now in the war? Assuming no offensive breaks in June, do the Russians relentlessly push forward? Do they seek to, as it were, mop up in the Donbass and entirely consolidate their control there? Or do they take the war to Odessa along the coast, liberate and fortress Transnistria and so on? In other words, how ambitious are Russia likely to be now in this conflict, in your view?
The longer this conflict goes on, the more ambitious the Russians will get. I mean, one of the things that isn't appreciated is the level of restraint shown by Vladimir Putin and the Russian government. There are many people in Russia who are chomping at the bit, so to speak, to have Russian forces capture Odessa, which they view as a Russian city, to have Russian forces link up with Transnistria, getting rid of that, that geopolitical nightmare, to capture Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Sumy, these other Russian cities, to bring an end to Ukrainian oppression of Russian culture, language, religion. But the Russian government right now seems to be intent on liberating those territories that it has absorbed into Russia proper and focusing on that effort. Now, this is a very bloody process. I think the battle for Bakhmut proves this. If the statistics put out by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group that carried the brunt of the fighting, are accurate, and there's no reason to doubt this, 75,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in that battle alone. Another 100,000 were wounded. The amount of equipment destroyed is mind-boggling. The damage, the destruction done to the city. And yet that's just one city. There's still 30, 35 of the Donetsk Republic, the Donetsk territory, that is in the control of the Ukrainians, and Russia has said that they are going to take that back. The Chechen forces, the Akhmat forces, are being redeployed into this area to carry out offensive operations to continue that. So it seems to me right now that Russia is focused on liberating the territories of Russia and limiting their offensive action to that. But they are carrying out strategic air campaigns designed to disrupt any potential Ukrainian counteroffensive. They're killing Ukrainians by the bushels. And I don't say this with glee in my heart. I say it with all the pain that must be mustered when you talk about needless death. But the Russians have said that one of their goals is demilitarization. And they had hoped to get the Ukrainians to do this in as less a violent a way as possible, to remove the stain of NATO from Ukraine. But NATO has insisted on painting Ukraine NATO blue and white. And so the de-NATO, the de-NATOizing process is going to be very bloody. It means the physical destruction of the Ukrainian army, and that's happening. There's another aspect of it, which is denazification. And I think this is going to require the collapse of the Ukrainian government, but Putin doesn't seem to have committed to this, that there is still the potential, at least it appears, for a negotiated settlement if Ukraine is willing to accept the reality of what Russia has accomplished. My concern is that the West won't allow Ukraine to accept this reality, and that this war, which should come to an end in late summer, early August, which is the time where I believe the Ukrainian armed forces will have exceeded their ability to sustain this conflict. But if it doesn't and it continues, I think that the next phase will be Vladimir Putin giving the green light for further acquisition of Ukrainian territory. But right now, as things stand, I believe the Russians are willing to accept a peace settlement, a termination of this conflict that limits Russian territorial gains to Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea.
Well, they're having a peace summit in Paris. The only problem is Russia isn't invited to it. How can you have a peace summit during a war when one of the parties to the war is not wanted on voyage?
Well, I think what this proves is that there's a split between the Ukrainian government and its NATO and European supporters. This conflict is unwinnable. NATO now realizes that. They realize that their investment is in vain, and that if they continue to go down the path that the trajectory of this conflict is taking, that Russia will succeed in not only destroying the Ukrainian army, but destroying the bulk of NATO's military infrastructure, especially that which has been given to Ukraine. And so in order to avoid this scenario, I think that there's pressure being placed on the Ukrainian government to come up with, to accept Russia's terms, to limit the damage that's done not only to Ukraine, but also to NATO in terms of reputation and in terms of capacity to wage war. So I think that's the scope and scale of the peace summit. It's an internal dialogue between Ukraine and the West. And Russia will be part of this process once Ukraine and the West can agree on what peace should look like.
It'll be there like Banquo's ghost hovering over the table. Scott Ritter, good to have you back on this side of the world, our side of the world. If only we could be more proud of our side of the world. But we're proud of you. Thank you for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.